Good day. Today is Sunday, 19th January 2025, and the news today, the first piece of news today is that the ceasefire agreement entered into between Hamas and Israel and basically achieved through the intervention of President-elect Donald Trump and his envoy, Stephen Witkoff, today comes into effect. I'm not going to discuss the ceasefire today in this program. We'll just have to wait and see over the next couple of days whether or not it is actually implemented. Most people who have observed the situation in the Middle East believe that this is just a remission and that the fighting will resume again. But as I said, this is a huge topic. I'm not going to discuss it in today's program. I would simply say that we'll just have to wait and see what happens over the next couple of days and what the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, who is going to be inaugurated tomorrow, is going to do to try to consolidate on the success he has achieved in brokering this particular ceasefire. What I would say about this is that if Donald Trump does want to move forward with some sort of peace process, a widespread peace process in the Middle East, he does have certain advantages to play for. Firstly, the Russian-Iranian strategic partnership agreement that I discussed yesterday ought to be, if understood properly, recognized for what it actually is, a stabilizing factor in the affairs of the Middle East. It looks as if other states in the Middle East, the Saudis and the others, are starting to get together as well, and they also seem to be preparing to make various diplomatic moves. And also the major breakthrough that has taken place over the last 15 months, though it has happened in the most awful and heartbreaking way. It is no longer possible to dispute the importance of the Palestinian question. And a new president, if he understands that, perhaps might be able to move the events forward in the Middle East in a way that has not really been possible until this time. But as I said, this is a huge topic. I'm not going to discuss it further in this program, and I don't want to give people the impression that I'm optimistic about the direction of events. Far from it, actually. All I am saying is that there might be glimmers of opportunities if the new US president, who is, by the way, the person who is in the decisive position of advantage, in that he possesses leverage and can also talk to all the parties, if the new president is prepared to take some political risks and to move the situation forward. Anyway, let's turn now to the perennial topic that dominates these programs, which is the situation in Ukraine. And of course, when I speak about the situation in Ukraine, I don't just mean what's going on in Ukraine itself, vitally important though that is, but also the general situation in Europe. Now, as I've discussed in many programs, any discussion of the Ukraine conflict needs to start with the military situation there, because it is that which is driving events and which is going to drive them increasingly fast. Now, a certain weariness about discussing the events of the war has, of course, taken hold. You can see that in every kind of discussion. I do not discuss the military situation in anything like the detail that I did, say, 2 years ago. Doing so takes up an enormous amount of time, and it makes it's something that when the war first began, people were obsessively interested about. But my sense is that most people, even if they've not lost entire interest, their ability to keep focused on every detail, every movement in every village, every acquisition of every millimeter of ground has declined simply because of the sheer overload of information that we've had over the entire 3-year period. But that doesn't mean the situation in the war has become less interesting or more predictable. On the contrary, in my opinion, it has never been as dynamic and as important as it is at the present time. Now, I say that because the last 36, 48 hours in the war have actually objectively been extraordinary, and they need further discussion. And they need further discussion if I'm going to go ahead and discuss some of the political moves that are taking place, as I intend to do later in this program. So let's first begin with the further big missile and drone strike that the Ukrainians launched against Russia about 48 hours ago. The Ukrainians launched another enormous drone strike, another missile strike, using ATACMS missiles, which they launched into Belgorod region in Russia. It's not clear what they were seeking to attack. Is another egregious violation of a Russian red line, one which President-elect Trump says that he vehemently disagrees with. We'll see whether he brings that practice to a stop. But anyway, the Ukrainians did launch another big drone attack combined with this missile attack, with ATACMS missiles on Russia. And as we will see later in the program, they are staking an awful lot on these attacks inside Russia. They're trying to persuade President-elect Donald Trump and his team that it is by intensifying these attacks, by giving these attacks everything that the West has, supporting Ukraine to intensify and accelerate them, that this and only this is the way in which a satisfactory peace, satisfactory, that is to say, to the Ukrainians, to the Europeans, to the Americans, to all of these people, it is the only way that such a peace can be achieved. Now, what is fascinating about this, and we're going to see that there's been an article in the Daily Telegraph that discusses all this in detail and sets out the Ukrainian point of view about this very clearly. What is absolutely fascinating about all of this is that these missile and drone strikes on Russia, when the Ukrainians promote them, when they insist that we press forward with them, they tell us absolutely nothing at all about their real effectiveness. What actually have these strikes in fact achieved? Well, let's now go to that Daily Telegraph article. It says that Ukraine has carried out some of its biggest strikes on Russian territory yet, using homemade drones, US-supplied ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles provided by Britain. Ukraine struck multiple targets in 4 Russian regions, hitting oil facilities, industrial plants, and military production sites more than 700 miles from the border. Did it actually hit those oil facilities, industrial sites, plants, and military production sites? Well, I'm going to say straight away that if you look at what the Russians are saying, the answer is no. They may have, some drones may have got through. They may have done a limited amount of damage. But there is no evidence that any significant damage was done by any one of these strikes. And the Russians claim, and I am sure that they are right to claim, that all of the ATACMS missiles that Ukraine launched in the last 48 hours against Russia, against Belgorod region, all 6 of them were shot down by the Russian air defences. None of them managed to get through and do any damage at all. Nonetheless, the Daily Telegraph, which is clearly relaying to us information that the Ukrainians are providing, goes on to claim that the attacks, these are the Ukrainian attacks, are having a significant impact on the Russian economy. Where is the evidence for this? Where is the evidence that at any point over the course of 2024, these attacks by Ukraine had any impact on the Russian economy at all? But then we go on to read Putin's greatest vulnerability, and it is vital that Ukraine is given support to compel the Kremlin to enter negotiations from necessity rather than choice. And this is now Yuri Podolyak, the advisor of Zelensky, who's speaking. He says, at the moment, 46% of the Russian refinery sector is under attack or within range of Ukrainian weaponry. This means that Russia is gradually losing a large part of this key sector of its economy. In addition, we are also hitting key military infrastructure across the European region of Russia. We need to be able to keep up this kind of pressure if we are to enter into negotiations from a position of strength. Only if Russia is suffering losses will it be willing to negotiate meaningfully. Well, as I said, what is the evidence that these strikes are actually achieving anything of significance? The Russians say that they are not. Economic data from Russia did not support the Ukrainian assertions that these strikes are achieving very much. The expectation is that the Russian economy in 2024 grew by just under 4%. GDP growth was just under 4%. Where is the evidence that there was real damage done to the Russian economy as a result of these strikes? We are told that in theory, and this is the Daily Telegraph, even the Daily Telegraph appears to have some doubts about these Ukrainian claims. In theory, targeting Russian refineries, which cost tens of billions of pounds, is effective because energy is the mainstay of the country's economy. I have discussed in many places how Westerners consistently overstate the importance of the fuel and energy complex within the Russian economy as a whole. But I would obviously not want to deny that it is a very important sector. Then the Daily Telegraph says it is unclear how much damage Ukraine has inflicted, as Russia has classified most of its oil production data. Well, in fact, if we're talking about oil fields, places where the oil is actually, where the drilling takes place and the oil is brought up from the ground, I don't think there's been any damage there at all. There have been strikes on refineries, but the damage has been minimal. And we are told that last month a Ukrainian drone attack forced Russia to shut down the primary oil refining units at the Novoshakhtinsk processing plant, its largest for the third time in a year. But if you know anything about oil refineries, you will know that actually they regularly stop, close for certain periods, then they resume work again. It's part of the inevitable part of any industrial process, something which, by the way, people who have no familiarity with it have little knowledge about. We're told that Russia's seaborne fuel shipments fell 9% in 2024, suggesting the attacks have forced Russia to cut down on exports and shore up its domestic capacity. Or alternatively, it could be that the Russians cut back oil exports because that they agreed to do so as part of their OPEC plus agreements with the Saudis and others, which in fact did require the Russians to reduce exports of oil. Just saying, maybe, in fact, definitely, that has had a bigger effect on reducing Russian oil exports, a far bigger effect than these pinprick attacks by the Ukrainians. And then, of course, comes the admission. A Ukrainian intelligence source, however, said Russia has mostly been able to repair oil facilities within a week, and only additional Western missiles, coupled with more robust energy sanctions, would force Putin to recalculate. So, when damage is done, and it is not done very often, against a gigantic energy complex, the Russians are able to repair it within a week. The Russians can absorb this damage, and there is no evidence, none at all, that it is having any significant effect on their economy. As for the ATACMS strikes, well, perhaps the least said about this debacle, the better. I have to say it straightforwardly, even I had not anticipated in the months and weeks prior to these attacks, in the long discussions that took place about them, how utterly ineffectual they would prove to be. I think I'm right in saying that only one missile attack that has taken place since the missile strikes began in late November has actually done any significant damage, and that was on a Russian military target in, from memory, Kursk region. But overall, the damage done has been absolutely insignificant. Westerners have been in complete denial about the failure of the ATACMS system in the conflict in Ukraine from the first moment of its delivery in December 2023. There have been many attacks, missile strikes with ATACMS missiles, going all the way back to a first strike on an airfield in Berdyansk, I believe in December 2023. Apart from that one first strike, the damage done has been minimal. And we've been told by the New York Times, that around 500 of these missiles were delivered to Ukraine, and it's quite likely that the Biden administration has delivered more over the last few weeks. This is probably a very significant part, in fact, this is a very significant part of the entire ATACMS inventory. It has been drawn down and it has achieved limited results. The contrast between the claims made about the ATACMS before it was delivered to Ukraine and the realities could not be starker. So, an unsuccessful missile, drone attacks that are ineffective, but consider what happened directly after, because in the hours after the latest missile and drone attack on Russia, the Russians launched a massive attack on Ukraine of their own. Now, I want to stress that I don't believe, despite the Russian Defense Ministry saying so, that this was a retaliatory strike. I am confident that the attack that the Russians carried out was one that, like all Russian missile and drone attacks, was prepared over many days and probably weeks. But we had massive missile strikes on Kiev. We've had attacks on industrial facilities in Kiev, more attacks on scientific laboratories, on energy complexes, and on a training college where apparently pilots for the F-16 fighter jets were being trained, and where at least one Danish instructor, according to the Russians, was killed, something which is almost certainly true. Of course, we don't know how many of the Ukrainian cadets were killed. One of the missile strikes in Kiev, by the way, a member of the Duran community, and here I would like to express my thanks to this person, did some geolocation and was able to find and send me satellite pictures of the actual place where the attack happened. And you can see that there not only was an attack, but that it did significant damage, or so I understand. Anyway, there it is. Ineffective attacks by the Ukrainians. Massively successful counterattacks by the Russians. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, as I said in a recent program, actually said that Ukraine no longer functions anymore as a state. Its economy, its industries exist only on life support provided by the West, and the army and the state are effectively disintegrating. And the fact that the Russians are able to launch strikes right across Ukraine almost without meeting significant resistance anymore, well, that, in my opinion, tells its own story. Now, we've had other attacks by the Russians, and of course I'm now talking about ground operations. And over the last 24 hours, the pace in ground operations has significantly, indeed dramatically accelerated. Now, literally every 30 minutes or so, that in the couple of hours before I started making this program, I was receiving updates about the situation in two places on the Ukrainian battlefronts. One is Velikaya Novosilka, which is now quite definitely being stormed. There are suggestions that in this small fortified town in southwestern Donbass, the town which is supposed to be the last major point in the defense system that Ukraine created between the militias, the positions that the militias had in 2022 in Donbass and the Dnieper River. As I said, Ukraine built these enormous fortified lines after the 2014 fighting. They apparently basically end where Velikaya Novosilka is. Anyway, the reports say that the Russians now control perhaps a third of this small town. I mentioned yesterday that there were reports that the Russians had broken in. They have apparently, according to these reports that I'm reading, of course, I'm not in a position to confirm them myself, but I've no reason to doubt that these are true. They have apparently captured the whole of the southern part of Velikaya Novosilka. That doesn't mean that there might not be some Ukrainian soldiers still resisting there, but overall the Russians have control of the southern part of Velikaya Novosilka. They've burst into Velikaya Novosilka from the north, And there were reports yesterday that the Ukrainian High Command has ordered Ukrainian troops to retreat from Velikaya Novosilka, except that the order has come too late. Velikaya Novosilka is unusual in that it is surrounded by small rivers. There's at least two small rivers, one of them the Mercouris River, on the western side of Velikaya Novosilka. At one point, these rivers provided ready-made fortified barriers, which the Russians needed to cross. But now that the Russians have crossed them and established presumably pontoon bridges and are advancing into the town itself, the rivers have created a trap, because in order to escape, the Ukrainian soldiers inside Velikaya Novosilka themselves have to cross these rivers, most specifically the Mercouris River. And apparently the Russians are there. They're basically on the other side, on the east bank, and their drones are also operating. And so far, it seems, it has proved impossible for the Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka to escape. It's likely, I'm going to make a guess, that this small town, the resistance there will collapse within the next couple of hours. The fact that it has continued for as long as it has done is because the Ukrainians are unable to escape and therefore have been left with the choice of either standing or fighting or surrendering en masse. These are some of Ukraine's few remaining high-quality soldiers. They're highly motivated, they're deeply patriotic, they don't want to surrender. But I'm going to make a guess that at some point resistance will finally collapse and the Russians will not only capture Velikaya Novosilka over the course of probably today, or perhaps at a stretch tomorrow, but that a significant number of prisoners this time will indeed be taken. So that's Velikaya Novosilka. The other place where there have been very dramatic developments, though I won't pretend that I have the same level of understanding of what exactly is happening, is Chasiv Yar. With every hour that passes, every 30 minutes to an hour that passes, I've been getting more reports of more advances by the Russians capturing more districts or micro-districts in Chasiv Yar. The industrial area, of course, was captured by the Russians a few days ago. The Russians are said to be near to the railway station and the city council building. Quite plausibly, within the next couple of hours, we'll see flags raised over both of these structures. Anyway, the point is that it looks as if the situation in Chasiv Yar is now accelerating, that Ukrainian resistance in Chasiv Yar, which has been intense and prolonged, is now coming to an end, and that the Ukrainians are about to lose this last important fortified town, which was part of the Bakhmut conurbation. So, dramatic events there, and the Ukrainians suffering major losses. There are also other things taking place in other places. Now, yesterday, as I said in my program, the Ukrainian MP, dissident MP, Mariana Bezuglaya, claimed that the Russians had actually entered Pokrovsk. I thought that it was most probably a sabotage and reconnaissance group of the Russian army that had entered the southern parts of Pokrovsk. But over the course of today, a video has appeared which appears to show Ukrainian soldiers taking up defensive positions inside southern Pokrovsk and preparing to counter what looks like a Russian advance with their rifles. Now that strongly suggests that there are indeed some Russian troops still in southern Pokrovsk, and that firefights between Ukrainian defenders and Russian troops in Pokrovsk itself are continuing to take place. But in some ways, what is going on inside Pokrovsk itself is arguably less important. Today, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that Vozhizhenka, the village south of the road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, has indeed been captured by the Russians. We've actually known this for a while, that Yelizavetivka, well, the Russian Defense Ministry have not told us that this village has also been taken, but it undoubtedly has been. The fact that the Russian Defense Ministry is now reporting progress in this area suggests that they're now confident that the position of the Ukrainians along this road east of Pokrovsk is deteriorating. And they're almost certainly right. And we're getting very dramatic news from the other end of Pokrovsk, the southwest of Pokrovsk, in the village of Kotlivo. It looks as if the Russians have captured a small group of industrial buildings in Kotlivo, and that they're also close now to capturing the rest of Kotlivo itself, and that they are pressing forward southwest of Kotlivo along the same road that Kotlivo lies upon, the road that ultimately leads to the Dnieper and to the city of Dnipro, that the Russians are pressing forward and pushing into this other village, which is Udachnye, which would bring the Russians, I understand, if it's captured, within around 2 kilometers of the border between Donetsk region and Dnipro region. So, very fast-moving events in all of these three places. It's likely that we are going to see a Russian advance into Pokrovsk within the next couple of weeks. The Russians, instead of launching a direct attack on Pokrovsk, have now followed the pattern that they have followed in other battles, in Selidovo, in Novogrodivka, in Korakhovo, which is to outflank and gradually encircle a city before attacking it. And what that does, as we have seen in all of those other places, is that it leads to the collapse of resistance in that city and to its capture very fast. And that looks like what we're going to see soon in Pokrovsk. So the events are moving very fast. And I am going to make a further suggestion here that with the Russians advancing, and in particular with the way in which the Russians are advancing against steadily weakening resistance from the Ukrainians, it is likely that Russian losses are actually falling. By contrast, an army in retreat, which is what the Ukrainians now are, is probably seeing its losses grow. Again, one can argue endlessly about the numbers. I'm not going to do so in this program, but just as my own sense is that the further the Russians advance, the stronger they become, I get the sense that the same is true in the opposite direction for the Ukrainians. The further they retreat now, the weaker they become. Now, there's fighting going on in all sorts of other places as well. There's fighting going on in Kursk region. There's been less reports of major movements in Kursk region over the last couple of days. Group of Forces North still claims that the Russians are advancing in Kursk region. It says that they advanced by 700 meters yesterday, for example. I don't quite know what that means, but that's what they claim. There's general agreement that the Ukrainians did try to launch some more counterattacks in Kursk region, but it seems that none of them were successful. And as I discussed in one of my more recent programs, it looks as if the Russians are now very close to capturing the entirety of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River. They have just captured the village of Tikha, and, well, that might put them in a position where they can launch more advances further south in Kharkiv region as well. So anyway, what we see is this growing imbalance in every part of the battlefront. The Russians are advancing and are growing stronger. The Ukrainians are growing weaker on the front lines. And in the missile war, well, the Russians have always had an overwhelming advantage, but that advantage is getting greater. And there's been rumors and reports of more advanced Russian missiles being used in the various missile strikes that have been conducted. I doubt that this is so, by the way. What I do get the impression is that the Russians gradually have shifted to using increasingly hypersonic missiles, Kinzhals, and perhaps Zircon missiles, and that they also now increasingly use their Iskander-M ballistic missiles. None of these missiles being capable of being intercepted by the very, very reduced Ukrainian air defense system. But anyway, the point is that with every single day, we can see that the military balance continues to shift ever further against Ukraine. And so I'm going to go now back to that article in the Daily Telegraph. The Daily Telegraph has been an enthusiastic supporter of Ukraine in this war. It has also clearly been very connected with thinking within the British government. And it also clearly has some degree of access to thinking in Ukraine, to what the Ukrainians are thinking and the message that they want to convey. And this article, whose title is Ukraine Warns that Trump that early peace talks would be catastrophic. Vladimir Zelensky wants the president-elect to bolster Kiev on the battlefield before opening negotiations with Russia. And the article, by the way, is by Adrian Blomfield. Anyway, this article basically is an attempt by Zelensky and his officials, and I have no doubt that in this they are backed by the British. I discussed in my programme yesterday the utterly zany agreement that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, signed off with Zelensky over the course of Starmer's hurried visit to Kiev. It's clearly an agreement which is intended to cut across Trump's efforts to get negotiations underway. Anyway, this article in the Daily Telegraph tells us what the message that the Ukrainians are trying to convey to Trump, the stories that they are spinning, and what their objective is, which is not, in my opinion, to delay negotiations, but to delay them indefinitely, to prevent negotiations from taking place at all. Now, I'm not going to read the entire article because it is, of course, behind a paywall, but I will read parts of it. It says this: forcing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia before it regains the advantage on the battlefield would be a catastrophic mistake, officials in Kiev have warned ahead of Trump's inauguration. Fearing that the new administration could reduce military aid if he refuses talks, which of course is exactly what he is doing, Zelensky is scrambling to make the case that Ukraine first needs time and support to escalate its campaign deep inside Russia. A failure to make Vladimir Putin feel pain before negotiating would embolden the Russian president, weaken Ukraine, and ultimately damage the West's reputation and interests, according to Mr. Zelensky's aides. And the Ukrainians, we're told, are very unhappy about self-imposed deadlines for talks. These include the 100 days that General Kellogg himself has apparently set himself in order to achieve peace. We agree that such self-imposed deadlines have caused deep concern in Kiev, where officials warn that rushing into talks would simply play into Putin's hands. And then we get Mikhailo Podolyak. I think I refer to him as Yuri Podolyak. He's actually Mikhailo Podolyak. The bottom line is that there are no simple, quick decisions to be made here. The initiative has to be controlled. It must not be given away to Russia. And then the article acknowledges that the Russians are advancing slowly but steadily, gaining ground around the important logistics center of Pokrovsk. But then we're told that we don't need to worry about that because the Ukrainian officials say they are making important headway far beyond the front lines. And then we got that long discussion about the missile strikes that I discussed earlier in the program. The long extract about the missile strikes. The fact that the Ukrainians are launching all of these missile strikes on Russia, on the oil refineries and the factories and all of that, that proves that Ukraine is engaging in an increasingly successful missile and drone war against the Russians. And what we need to do is to double, triple, quadruple on that. And if we do, that will lead to success. Ukraine has increased domestic drone manufacturing with record production levels expected in 2025. And we're told that what the West needs to do is to double down on all of this, and that if this is done by providing more missile strikes, conducting more missile strikes, more drone strikes, then this is what is going to transform the situation. And as for the kind of peace that is being talked about, there should be, of course, European troops sent to Ukraine. Ukrainian officials warn any ceasefire could only be enforced if Western forces were willing to strike hard at Russia if it violated the truce. This would mean enforcing a no-fly zone for Russian aircraft over Ukraine, training missiles on targets in Russia, ready to retaliate instantly to a breach of the ceasefire, and training and bolstering Ukraine's exhausted army. This is what Mr. Podolyak is apparently saying. And we're also told that, of course, there is only one real way to deter Russia, and this is from another of Zelensky's aides, Mrs. Sotnik, and that is to take that step which the US and some of its allies remain firmly opposed to. The only really sustainable security guarantee is NATO membership for Ukraine. So, Give us more missiles. We're actually achieving lots with these missiles. Help us to conduct more drone strikes on Russia. These are doing real harm, real damage to the Russians. The fact that we cannot provide any actual evidence that they are, the fact that they're shooting down all our missiles is something, we don't really need to concern ourselves about. That's probably just propaganda from the Russians. We can just disregard it. But, the fact that we are saying that these missiles are getting through and that the drones are getting through and that they're doing real damage, well, because we say it, you must believe it and you must give us more. And then, when we do get some kind of ceasefire, you must send tens upon tens of thousands of European troops into Ukraine. And when the Russians break the ceasefire, which of course they will, then these European troops, these Western troops, must be prepared to attack the Russians. We must conduct missile strikes on an enormous scale right across Russia. We must also, in that kind of scenario, impose a no-fly zone on the Russians right across Ukraine. And we should also press forward to grant Ukraine NATO membership. This is, it is beyond belief that this is being seriously suggested. And what makes this all incredibly alarming is that this article has just appeared immediately after Prime Minister Starmer's visit to Kiev. And it's appeared in a British newspaper, one which has strong connections with the British political and military authorities. And I'm going to suggest that, in fact, this article reflects discussions that the Ukrainians and the British had with each other and have continued having with each other, and which were continued by Zelensky and Starmer directly whilst they were in Kiev, and which reflect British government policy as much as Ukrainian government policy. What the Ukrainians and the British are trying to do is not only derail negotiations entirely. They don't want negotiations between Donald Trump and Putin. They've made that absolutely clear. What they want is the United States to impose some kind of ultimatum on the Russians. They still appear to believe that that will in some way force the Russians to cease the war. And then they want to send troops, European troops, NATO troops, to Ukraine, and then, of course, as part of a supposed ceasefire. And then, of course, the ceasefire is going to be violated because the Ukrainians will have every incentive, in that case, to make sure that the ceasefire breaks down. The Russians, of course, will be blamed. The call will then come to the White House that because the Russians are breaking the ceasefire, we must start the war all over again. But this time, on this occasion, the West must be directly involved. It must impose no-fly zones. It must engage in massive missile strikes right across Russia. The Western troops in Ukraine, which, as I have said many times, if we're talking about 100,000 men or 140,000 men or all these incredible numbers that people have been talking about, that is a war-fighting force. It is not a peacekeeping force. What we want is fighting between these forces and the Russians, backed by no-fly zones, which, of course, must all be enforced by the Americans, by the American Air Force. This is a blueprint for World War III. I don't know whether Starmer himself understands that, or his ministers do, whether the British authorities understand it, the level of anger and obsession that must exist in order to lead us down this incredible, dangerous path, especially in London, must be absolutely off the scale. I cannot imagine any British official or set of officials thinking in this extraordinary way, let alone British ministers, thinking in this extraordinary way at any time before, during the Cold War. So, as I said, things have clearly got completely out of control in London. But anyway, this is what these people are trying to do, the Ukrainians and the British. And we now see the real purpose of the missile and drone strikes on Russia. The important thing is not whether they actually inflict any real damage on the Russians, because in fact they are not they're not actually inflicting any significant damage on the Russians. The whole purpose of these drone and missile strikes is to fool Donald Trump and his officials into thinking that, in fact, these strikes really are carrying out significant damage on the Russians, so as to get the Americans, the new administration, to commit even more deeply to this conflict than they have been up to now. Now, I'm going to say this. Thankfully, my sense is that the Americans, that's to say Trump and his people, have seen through all of this. There are some reports today that the Americans are signalling that they are not going to accept Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, Starmer's choice for British ambassador to Washington, that the Americans are going to tell the British that they're not prepared to accept the appointment of Peter Mandelson as Britain's ambassador to the United States. Now that, I believe, if it happens, would be a unique snub. I don't think anything like that has happened at any time in Anglo-American relations, certainly since the Second World War, and perhaps for much, much longer than this. If there has been any instance when the Americans have refused to accept a British ambassador, please someone tell me, because I cannot think of one. Now, I would say that for the moment, the British are saying that they nonetheless still expect Mandelson to be appointed and accepted by the Americans. But the fact that these reports are circulating at all suggests that Trump and his people are already becoming increasingly frustrated and angry with the British. And there have been various other signals suggesting that the Americans are indeed unhappy with what their erstwhile allies, the Ukrainians and the British, and I would add the British and Emmanuel Macron, have been up to as well. We've seen that General Kellogg called off his visit to Kiev. Apparently he's travelled to Paris instead. Not quite clear what he's doing there. But anyway, he has. It's now being said, semi-informally, we're getting reports, that the decision to call off Kellogg's visit was not just because Trump realised that he needed to speak to Putin first before establishing direct contacts with the Ukrainians. It is because Kellogg and Trump also understood that Ukrainian policy, the intentions of Zelensky and his officials remain at total variance with their own, so that there is absolutely nothing useful to talk about with the Ukrainians at the present time. There's been much discussion, some of which I've engaged in my own programs on this channel, about the complex issues the Americans and the Russians are going to have to work out before they start discussing Ukraine with each other, and the difficulty the Americans and the Russians might have in coming to a consensus about Ukraine. It's clear, however, that the problems the Americans are having with the Russians pale as compared to those the Americans are having with the Ukrainians. Because what does this article in the Daily Telegraph ultimately tell us, other than the fact that the Ukrainians basically don't want to negotiate with the Russians at all, and that they're getting backing from the British and arguably from the French as well in trying to avoid negotiating with the Russians at this time. And over and above the news that Kellogg is not going to Kiev, there were reports also circulating yesterday that the Trump people have rejected repeated efforts from Zelensky to get an invitation to come to Trump's inauguration tomorrow. It seems that Zelensky has, on at least 3 occasions, sought an invitation from the Americans. I was sure, in fact, I said in various programs that I was sure that he would want to come and that he would want to be seen speaking and negotiating with Trump in Washington directly after the inauguration. But it seems that someone in Washington, quite plausibly Trump himself, has made the decision that Zelensky must be kept away. And again, if we go back to that Daily Telegraph article, we can see why. The Ukrainian leader has engaged in endless, energetic lobbying since Mr. Trump's election victory in November, sending delegations to Washington to meet the president-elect's aides as well as his allies in Congress, seeking to combine flattery with persuasion. The head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament even nominated Mr. Trump for the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. I have to say, I think that is so blatant that I think that will have annoyed Trump more than impressed him. Given what the Ukrainians are actually trying to do, given that they're trying to sabotage peace talks, they're trying to get the Americans to escalate, they want more oil sanctions, they want more missiles, they want more weapons, they want the Americans to impose ultimatums on the Russians, they want ceasefires, which will eventually break down, but which they hope will lead to Western intervention on their behalf. Why would the Americans at this time want to talk to the Ukrainians? And then we're told that Ukrainian officials, the chief hope is that if the incoming president cannot be persuaded to offer the support needed on the battlefield, he can at least be convinced not to abandon Ukraine entirely. while Mr. Trump may hope to negotiate directly with Putin, and then of course there's this studied insult, alpha male to alpha male, that is in the article itself, the president-elect risks repeating Joe Biden's hapless departure from Afghanistan if Russia is allowed to dismember Ukraine, they warn. Exactly the same threat made by Robert Kagan in his article in The Atlantic is being made here by the Ukrainians. If you abandon Ukraine, you will suffer the same fate as Joe Biden. Joe Biden is blamed for the defeat in Afghanistan, and you will be blamed for the defeat in Ukraine. And inevitably, the Munich Agreement, mentioned by Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky, that speech in the House of Lords that I also discussed a short time ago. Anyway, the Munich Agreement has resurrected itself as well. Some even draw parallels with Neville Chamberlain's sacrifice of Czech territory in the Sudetenland under the Munich Agreement of 1938, arguing that territorial concessions to Putin would be seen as similar appeasement. Just as these agreements contributed to, rather than prevented, the Second World War, we really want to prevent a third one, says Maria Mezentseva, a Ukrainian MP, at the forefront of Ukraine's diplomatic strategy in Europe. This is said about preventing World War III in one and the same article in the Daily Telegraph, in which we see Ukrainian aides setting out the blueprint for World War III. Western forces in Ukraine, no-fly zones over Ukraine, missile strikes, not just by the Ukraine, but by the West itself, right across Russia with Tomahawk missiles, all of that. And they claim that they've convinced the administration that Russian aggression is less about the acquisition of Ukrainian territory than it is about the reallocation of influence. This is from Podolyak. In other words, that Putin's ultimate aim is as much the destruction of the West as the conquest of Ukraine. I cannot believe that Donald Trump or any member of his team genuinely believes that. But anyway, we have all of this going on. We have more comments in this article about Donald Trump's desire to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, as I said, things which I cannot imagine that Donald Trump is remotely interested in. But there it is. We see what the true Ukrainian objective is, what the British objective is, what Emmanuel Macron's objective is, what the European Commission's objective is, what the objective of people like Annalena Baerbock, who has ostentatiously fomented an argument between herself in Germany and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz over further arms deliveries and support for Ukraine. She demanded, along with the German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, more a stepping up of military aid to Ukraine. Scholz said, slow down, this isn't what we want to do at this present time. Even Friedrich Merz, the until very recently very hardline leader of the CDU party, he's actually started to walk back some of the things that he has been saying he would do if elected. He's no longer talking quite so freely about supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and he too seems to be gradually retreating a little on Ukraine. But the hardliners in Germany are still there. Baerbock staged this confrontation with Scholz at a German cabinet meeting, Somebody took a photograph of her leaving the meeting, even as Scholz was trying to persuade her to stay. This photograph is really quite extraordinary. You can see what all of these people are trying to do. They're trying to get the United States and Donald Trump not just to recommit to the conflict in Ukraine itself, but ultimately to win the war. The war which they all know they cannot win without the United States. As I discussed in my programme yesterday, Lord Dannett, former head of the British Army, says that the British would struggle to put a force of 5,000 men together to send to Ukraine. So would all of the other European countries. None of them is in a position to send a strong military force to Ukraine. It would not be a tripwire force. It would be a force sent to Ukraine in order to provoke a war in which the Ukrainians would come along and say to the Americans, you cannot abandon us. If you abandon us, the West is lost, NATO is finished, your power, your global power will be broken. You must therefore come to our aid, however you think about it. And if that means risking World War III with Russia, well, we're sure that Putin is bluffing. After all, that's what we've been saying incessantly, and therefore it must be true, and you must believe what we say. Well, I don't want to discuss this further in this program. All of this depresses me incredibly. Note that there is no real denial in this article that Ukraine is losing the war against Russia. The fact is that the Russian army is pushing steadily westwards. I should say that I did a recent program with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, in which Colonel Davis, who is after all a person who knows a lot more about these kind of things than I do, he actually wondered whether the US military also would really be up to fighting the Russian army in Ukraine. To be clear, he's not suggesting that the United States isn't still militarily extremely powerful. The point is whether they could defeat the Russian army in Ukraine. It would absorb the entire US army to fight in Ukraine, and the Russians would still have a convincing manpower advantage, and they would be fighting close to their own territory. I have to say, all of these ideas are insane, and I hope that all of this will come to nothing, and we can see why Trump, over the last couple of days, apparently took the decision that enough's enough. There's no point in talking to the Ukrainians. They don't want to negotiate. Let's just go ahead, talk with the Russians at least, and see what we might be able to do. The other thing to say is that this article also tells us why it would be incredibly dangerous, in my opinion, to involve the Ukrainians, and by the way, the Europeans as well, in any discussions between the Russians and the Americans. Whilst the Europeans, the British, and the Ukrainians are in this kind of mood, it's all but impossible to see how negotiations could move forward, given that the Ukrainians and the Europeans would simply want to obstruct them. And that is indeed a real danger. Again, you can find it. It's all set out in this actually, in some ways, very helpful article in the Daily Telegraph. If we go back to Olyena Sotnik, who is an advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister, in other words, one of the political team in Kiev, the same person who said that Ukraine needed to be admitted to NATO. Anyway, she said that if the talks do go ahead, it is vital the talks are not simply between Russia and the US, but that Ukraine and its European partners, particularly Britain, are also at the table. Well, it remains up to Donald Trump to decide whether he really wants the British there. But on the evidence of the agreement between Starmer and Zelensky, on the evidence of this article, I would strongly advise him not to have them there at all. And the fact that he's apparently unhappy about Peter Mandelson's appointment suggests to me that at some level he might have come already to that very same conclusion. Anyway, there we are. Now, I do want to address this issue about Trump owning Ukraine, being responsible for Ukraine, for the failure, the disaster in Ukraine, if Ukraine is eventually defeated and perhaps dismembered. Well, again, I'm going to go back to Daniel Davis. He's written, I think, one of his finest pieces. This is in 1945, US military magazine. It reads, "Blame Joe Biden if Ukraine loses the war to Russia." And in the article, Davis goes through every single step that Biden has taken throughout the war and has shown how on every occasion he has chosen escalation in place of negotiation with disastrous consequences. Davis makes the point that the Russians have a massive inherent advantage over Ukraine. They're a far bigger country. They have far greater resources. They are a nuclear superpower. Ukraine is none of those things. They're able to produce war material. In fact, the Europeans tell us, the Europeans themselves have said, that the Russians are currently producing 3 times more material than all of the West combined. And, of course, if other friends of Russia were to join in, if the Chinese were to join in, well, I shudder to think what that would mean. In fact, the Chinese have actually spoken about this. There was a meeting in the UN Security Council, and Geng Shuang, China's deputy permanent representative at the UN Security Council, actually made some points about this, and this is taken from Global Times. He said that there's been constant attempts to try and blame the conflict in Ukraine upon China and to claim that China is assisting Russia. He said that if China, this is from Global Times, they're summarizing Geng's words, if China had really provided military supplies to Russia, the situation on the battlefield would not have been where it is now. That is absolutely true, and no one should have any doubt about it. Anyway, put that aside. The Russians outmatch the Ukrainians massively in every field of military production. And nothing that the West can do or has been able to do can change that situation. And this should have been obvious right from the beginning. But Biden took a different course. Biden punted, this is from Daniel Davis's article, Biden punted at each moment of opportunity, refusing to take either preventative measures that might have avoided war or multiple off-ramps that could have ended the war and limited the damage to US and Ukrainian interests. The war should never have happened. Biden was given a golden opportunity to prevent war in the autumn of 2021. And then Davis discusses the negotiations. He points out that even floating the idea of eventual Ukrainian membership of NATO is ridiculous given the realities in Ukraine at the moment, and yet that nonetheless was what Biden and Western officials have continuously insisted on doing, and this was ultimately what led to war. Davis then says that once war was thrust upon Ukraine and the West, Biden had another golden opportunity less than 2 months in to end the war through diplomacy. Russian and Ukrainian diplomats met in Istanbul and both emerged agreeing the general terms for a deal to end the war. But then, of course, as we know, the deal was sabotaged, partly by Boris Johnson, but also by Biden himself, who mere days later announced a new $33 billion aid package to allow Ukraine to keep the war going. And Davis says, imagine how many Ukrainian men would be alive today if Biden had taken that off-ramp. And then he continues, there could have been, there might have been a serious effort made to achieve peace in November 2022, as was proposed by none other than General Milley. With what sincerity, by the way, I don't know. But anyway, Milley did suggest it in November 2022, at a time when the Ukrainians were in a reasonably strong position after their successful Kharkiv and Kherson counteroffensives. But as Davis said, instead of insisting that Ukraine make a deal then, under the best negotiating conditions they would ever get, Biden supported and encouraged Ukraine to launch into a major countrywide offensive the next year. That proved, as Davis correctly says, a completely predictable disaster. But despite that, the Biden administration continued throughout 2024 to insist that Ukraine was going to defeat Russia, and that, as Zelensky himself as recently as June 2024 said, Ukraine was going to win, driving Russia all the way back to the 1991 borders. And even in the last months of the war, the United States, the Biden administration, still has made no serious effort to begin negotiations or put together any credible plan to win the war in Ukraine, such a plan being impossible because the war can't be won. So, if it all ends in disaster, it won't be because of Trump. It will be ultimately because of Biden. And if Trump can somehow mitigate that disaster by negotiating a peace, he should not be criticised. He should be commended for doing so. Now, I'm going to finish this program by mentioning the other big event which has taken place over the last 24, 36 hours, which is that the Chinese President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump had a telephone call with each other. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry has actually provided us with a readout, and it's actually an interesting readout, and in some ways, if I say, a rather warm one. There's been a great deal of heartburn and misgiving across Europe that a major opinion poll that has been done around the world has found that outside Europe, most people around the world are delighted that Donald Trump has been elected and are relieved to see the back of Joe Biden and his team. If you've been following programs on this channel, if you've been listening to us on the Duran, you will not find that difficult. The Biden administration has already took what was already a very tense and very bad international situation and managed to make it far, far worse. It might surprise people to learn that this relief that the Biden administration is going and that Trump is coming back, this relief almost certainly extends to China itself. The Chinese had many issues with Donald Trump. They're clearly unhappy with some of the things that he has said and with some of the things that members of his team have said. But they had numerous dealings with him. Xi himself found that he could get on at a personal level with Donald Trump. The Chinese never came away with the sense when they were speaking to Donald Trump, as they did with Biden, that Trump was lying to them and trying to deceive them. And overall, I think that the Chinese think that however difficult and challenging the relationship with the United States is going to be with Donald Trump as president, it's going to be less difficult and less challenging than it was with the endlessly slippery and ultimately hyper-aggressive Joe Biden and his team as well. Anyway, there's been a number of warm words in the Chinese readout, and there's a number of paragraphs in which they set out what they've been talking, the two things that they talked about. President Xi pointed out that it was natural for two big countries with different national conditions to have some disagreements. The important thing is to respect each other's core interests and major concerns and find proper solutions. The Taiwan question concerns China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The US side needs to approach it with prudence. It's what Xi has been repeatedly saying, but here he's using rather more emollient language than he did in the very angry messages, and I thought they were increasingly angry messages, that you saw in the readouts, the Chinese readouts of Xi's conversations with Joe Biden. And then Xi went on to say that economic ties are mutually beneficial, confrontation and conflict should not be an option. The two sides should follow the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. And then we're told that President-elect Trump thanked Xi for his congratulations and said he values his great relations with President Xi, which I'm sure is true. And then it's thrown in that the two leaders also exchanged views on the Ukraine crisis, the Palestinian issue, and other major international and regional issues of mutual interest. The two leaders agreed to set up a channel of strategic communication to keep in regular touch on major issues of shared interest. Now, many people assume that much of this conversation was taken up with a discussion of TikTok, and undoubtedly the two leaders, which Trump will be as of tomorrow, did discuss TikTok. It would be surprising if they didn't. The Supreme Court has upheld the government's position on TikTok, as many people expected. TikTok has gone dark as I am speaking. There's apparently some resentment about this on the part of some of its users, just saying. But Trump appears to be holding out for some kind of an agreement on TikTok with the Chinese. Well, we will see what comes with that. I think the Chinese are indeed annoyed about TikTok. Annoyed is probably an understatement. And the attack on TikTok did, of course, begin during Donald Trump's first term. But my own sense is that they can ride with TikTok. It's important, but it's not strategically important to them in the way that some people appear to believe. And my sense from this readout, which Chinese readout, which doesn't, by the way, mention TikTok at all, is that Xi Jinping, rather like Putin, is saying to Trump, or at least Putin will say to Trump, but Xi has said to Trump, look, we've had all of these accumulated problems. We're all happy to see Biden go. He made things far, far worse. We understand that some things, like perhaps TikTok, can't be undone. But let's see if we can at least move forward together and get this relationship that exists between us back on track. It won't be where it was back in the good days when it seemed like we were not just partners, but perhaps even friends. Maybe we are destined to be adversaries now, but adversaries doesn't have to be the same as enemies. And we still can do all kinds of things with each other in trade, the economy, on international questions where we can move forward and agree. But Taiwan continues to be, for us, an absolute red line. If you cross that red line, you will see the relations between our countries destroyed, just as happened when you crossed the Russians' red line over Ukraine. So I think this is the message the Chinese are trying to convey. And I suspect that, again, Trump himself will have heard that, though what he intends to do about China, I be quite frank and say, I am not myself so sure. I think more likely than not, he would be prepared to meet Xi halfway. But then as we have seen many times, halfway, but as we have seen many times, it may not be fully up to him. Anyway, there we are. That's where I'm going to leave these issues today. I remain deeply shocked and troubled by the direction the British government and political class are taking Britain to. I hope we avoid in Britain any real harm about this. If we do, it will not be because of luck or good sense on our part. It's because there are, thankfully, actual grown-ups dealing with international affairs in other countries, in Moscow, in Beijing, and hopefully before long in the United States as well. Well, this is where I end my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. More from me tomorrow. Good day until then.